So in order to get started with DataFed, right, we are using the command lib file, and within that file, the API class, which is why I pointed you all towards this particular page, which is the doc strings that are automatically, or documentation that is automatically generated. So we're basically using this class to communicate with DataFed, okay? And so we start off by basically importing just the API class from DataFed, and then we instantiate the API class without passing any arguments or keyword arguments, as so. Let's try out our very first function. It's not going to be particularly useful in this case, but let's try to list out all the projects that we are part of, and we do that by using the project list function. A handy tip for those of you who are not very familiar with Jupyter is you can hit Shift and Tab, and it shows you the doc strings associated with that particular function. Hit it once more, and it lets you scroll through and read the whole documentation. You hit it 4 times, 1, 2, 3, 4. It puts a persistent window on the bottom where you can, if you refer to it as and when you type code. So this is something that's handy to keep in mind as we move forward. Right. So so what we get back from this project list function is something quite interesting. It's basically a listing of different projects we're part of. In your case, you're likely to only see this one item here because you're only part of the training project. Since I've been using DataFed for a while, I have a few more, but this is generally what you should be seeing. And your count should be 20 because that's the maximum it's going to display, and your total should be 1. And what we get back is basically all this is basically a Google protobuf or a Google protocol buffer message as it happens. I didn't understand this too when I started using DataFed for the first time, but at the end of the day, everything is still a Python object, so you can start to dig into it and you can get pieces out of this response. So let's do exactly that. In fact, so let's just do what anybody who's not familiar with a particular Python function or Python class will try to do, which is to basically use this length and type functions on this to explore what we're seeing. So as it turns out, the object that we got has 2 parts apparently. As you can tell from this tuple, it had whatever was this portion, that was the first item, and then there's a string says it's a listing reply, which is a kind of reply you would get from DataFed, right? So typing this again, looking at just indexing just the first element or the 0th index item would basically give us this really long response. Basically, as you can tell, it is a Google protobuf reply, if you will. So DataFed basically uses these messages to talk from the client to the main DataFed core server. Yes, Dale, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I just wanted to interject. In the future, we plan on having a place you can go and clearly understand what commands are going to generate what messages or reply objects and things like that. So don't feel bad if you feel a little bit lost as it is right now.
Right. We'll be seeing a lot of these responses as we go forward. So you'll get used to these sort of replies. And the other thing I want to mention is Dale is thinking about replacing these. Not necessarily always replacing them, but perhaps simplifying the manner in which the information is returned back to the user. So that's another thing that he's thinking about, at least. Hey, Chris. Want to say something?
I get a different response, and I see that Kelly Rowland gets the same thing. It's a SDMS anon.
It's still a listing reply, which is really all the information that you
That's true.
I suppose it's interesting. Is the message types.
So basically, listing reply and SDMS anon PB2 listing reply are actually the same thing. It's basically as I mentioned before, those modules that store these messages and replies that's the module that one is in.
Either way, the behavior is identical. So not to worry, Kelly or Chris, it's the same thing. Okay, so don't worry about these messages. We'll go over how to understand them and to tear them apart and get the pieces of information that we want out of them very shortly. Before we do that, though, I want to just quickly go over the same concept of context, which I went over in the slides. So if you recall, I'm going to go back to the DataFed web portal every now and then. So you can see that there is personal data, project data, and shared data, right? So those are the contexts that I'm largely talking about here. So in order for us to find out exactly in which space DataFed is pointing us into, we can just hit that next cell, and what we'll notice is it says u/whatever username is, right? And what that basically is saying is that it is DataFed is pointing us at our personal data by default. So if I go here, so it's basically pointing me at this, if you will. So it's u/Somnath is just myself. So it's pointing that this is the scope for where we're working, which is not necessarily where you want to be. So there is a way for you to not work in your personal space, but work in the context of this project that I've created for you. So here we go. So I've created a project where everyone should have access to it. If you replied a little too late with your information, I might not have added you to this project, but every one of you should be here, and every one of you should have, your own collection, and you can. The idea is that you'll be able to work within the context of this particular project, right? So if you wanted to specify that, hey, no, I meant to look at the root collection. So every particular space, whether it is your own personal space or the project, will have a root collection. It's always going to be having the alias, which is root. So if you wanted to look at the root collection of the project, what we need to do is specify this keyword argument called context. So that allows you to specifically look at the root collection of the particular project only. All right. Obviously, if you didn't specify that and you just said, no, I just want to look at the root, because the default context was your own user space, it'll say, oh, I'm looking at the root collection for this particular user only. So the next I want to jump into a part we were touching upon earlier, the idea of actually dealing with these messages that we get and making sense of them. So as you can tell, right, we have numerous users here, which are the attendees for this tutorial. What we can do is, let's not worry about the function right here specifically. This function, what we want to do is look at the different collections that are a part of this root collection in our project. And the way we go about doing that is collection items list. It's a function in DataFed. So if I hit Shift Tab, it tells you that all you need to specify is the ID or the alias for the collection, in which case I've given root here. And I set the context to the project, because if I didn't do that, it'll just list my personal collections listing, if you will. And what I'm going to do after that is capture the response in this variable. I'm going to call it ls_resp as a response. I'm going to print that out. All right. So what we'll get in return is, again, this listing, just like we had for the project. So again, you might get this sdms_enon.pb2, whatever it is, or you might get this Google protobuf. But at the end of the day, you will see a giant listing of every one of your names and the ID for your collection, etc. Right? So that is something that everybody should be able to see. So now, now that we have an object to work with, let's actually start dealing with tearing things out of this, pieces of information out of this thing. So, for example, if we wanted to get, let's say, offset or something like, so what we would have to do is ls_resp, because that was a variable which contains this particular object that has the message that we got back, and I don't want the first item, which is I don't want the item at index 1, which is basically the string. I want the 0th one, so that would be this guy right here. And then I don't want all of it. I just want to get dot maybe offset. Oops, can't type today. So there we go. That's how you would get the kind of information out. Yes, it might seem a little intimidating at first, but as we go through this a few times and you see a number of different responses, you'll get used to subscripting and indexing and iterating over these objects. All right, so that's how you get, for example, a field like offset out of this. We can also look at the very last collection that we got out of this. So the way we would do that is, I don't want this offset or total or content, so I could instead ask for item. An item apparently gives me a giant listing of each of those objects. It was printed right there. Yes, it looks somewhat different, and that's just the nature way of how Google protobuf messages respond. But I could then ask for -1, which is the very last item, and this is the response that I get here. So I got back my own collection. If you do -1, you will get my collection. If you change the index accordingly, you will get somebody else's collection. So if we do -2, I'll get Sly's collection. There we go. And then after that, there are different fields here like ID, title, alias, and so on and so forth. And again, it's just think of it as any other Python object. It just so happens to have it be more like an onion, where you have to peel through different layers of an onion to get to what you want. So for example, if I wanted to I'll go back to -1 because that's what I have in the example following this. If I wanted to just get the title information out of it, I just ask for .title, and I get my title out of this this collection. So,
if anyone needs a quick reference to accessing these fields and the iterability and subscriptability, just check your cheat sheet as we go forward.
Oh, that's right. Yes, Jess has put together these the cheat sheet here, which I forgot to point to. So she has this thing here. So feel free to download this and keep this as a separate tab, if you will, if you want to have a quick pointer towards some piece of information and you want to refer to it or something. All right. Yeah. So brilliant. The next thing I wanted to point out to, something that you will certainly need to get used to, is the concept of iterating. It's nothing particularly new to DataFed. It's something that we all do in Python in general. And for example, we got to, for example, the title here in this particular case. If we wanted to get to the ID field and the alias field, what we would do is, we would have to iterate through every single item that is there in this message, which is why I have ls_resp of 0, which gets us the giant listing of items. And then I look up, obviously the item field to get the giant listing. And then I can say for each record, go ahead and give me the ID and the alias. And this is what we get back. Apparently, you didn't give an alias to this person. I don't know who this person is, but okay. Is everybody okay so far? This is standard Python, no special tricks associated with DataFed. Just pointing out that you have to be comfortable with the subscripting and iteration and indexing capability in general in Python. I think the last concept I want to go over, which is a really basic concept, is the concept of aliases and IDs. So that's the whole reason I printed out these two separate things. So you can, for example, we do have a project shared. Where is project shared? Here we go. This is project shared. So this is where, for example, it's not necessary that all projects have to be organized the way you're seeing the training project organized. But let's say that you wanted to access the project share. One way to do that would be by typing either the alias associated with the item, whether it's a collection or a record, it doesn't matter, or you could use the ID. But there's a nuance associated with this, which is why when you execute the cell, you will see an error. This is intentional because of the fact that project share is something. It's an alias which is only local to the training project and is not local to your default context, which is your personal data. So remember, we're still operating with DataFed thinking that we by default want to operate in our personal data, but that's not the case. We actually do want to operate in our project data. So which is why we have to keep in mind this concept of the context. So I have the very first of what I'd like to call an exercise. So if you see text in green, whether you're using the HTML or a notebook, if you see this thing in green, that's basically a place where I haven't solved this for you, but we'd like you to solve it. All right. So I've told you that the way you can specify the context for DataFed is by using this keyword argument called context. So if I hit Shift Tab, you can see that this function only takes two items, either an ID or an alias. In this case, we've taken the alias and then the context keyword argument. So I'm going to stop here and then ask that you take maybe 60 seconds to figure out if you can get the if you can view the project shared collection by using its alias PROJSHARE. So I am going to solve the problem for you all. So if anybody hasn't managed to figure it out, it was just basically copy paste the same thing again and say context equals whatever it was. What was it? P something. There we go.
And there is a prefix syntax, which is documented in the online documentation. So I just point everyone to that online documentation to understand that. But essentially, you would say U:username : alias, and that would get you to that same collection without specifying the context.
Okay,
but
fine.
In the context of writing a Python script, it's probably better to set the context.
So you're saying if I do this and I just cut this out and pasted it here, that would do the same job?
No, not quite. It's P:.
P colon?
Yeah, and then : project share.
There we go. Not something I use on a daily basis, but I learned something as well.
That's the fully qualified alias name.
Right. Yes, if you want to do it that way too, there's apparently a third way of addressing a particular object. But the point I was trying to drive is whatever's in bold right here, that the IDs are unique across DataFed, and you don't need to specify a context for an ID because it doesn't matter whether this number is never going to be repeated anywhere else in DataFed. It's unique to this particular collection project share in this particular. It's unique all over DataFed, not just to this particular project. So that was about IDs and aliases. So remember, the takeaway point is if you want to specify by alias because it's convenient, that's okay, but you have to specify the context as well. But specifying the context every single time this manner can be very tedious and you might accidentally forget it. So if you're sure you're going to work within a particular space or a particular context, what we would recommend you to do is use this other function called set context. Right, so that if you tell DataFed that no, I want you to think of I want you to know that I only want to work within the training project, you can certainly say that. And now, if you wanted to say I want to view the project share collection again, and I hit Shift Enter, it doesn't give me an error because it now knows that I am working within the context of the project. So df_API of get context. There we go. Because earlier it was your particular user account, so u/something, but now it's switched over to the project, so we are working entirely within the scope of this particular project.